to another review, and this time we are talking about some IDW Transformers. Okay, so recently I got the first 3 volumes of IDW's Transformers collections, which are basically these really nice hardcovers that collect all of IDW's Transformers universe in what they call their suggested reading order. They don't collect them in publication order, they don't collect them in chronological order, they collect them in kind of like a hybrid version where they give you everything that you need to know to fill in certain storylines. So like this thing starts with Megatron Origin but ends with Infiltration, despite Infiltration being the kind of kickoff to this Transformers universe. So this makes for a really confusing reading order, and there are a lot of things I've been reading lately about people complaining about some of the placement. For example, in this first volume, you get Transformers Spotlight Soundwave, which comes at the tail end of this, and then you read Infiltration, and then you read Stormbringer in the next volume, but Spotlight Soundwave makes reference to and happens after Stormbringer. So it's kind of weird, and there are some continuity issues in the early stuff that gets fixed later, most notably being that there's a thing here in this first volume in the Spotlight Blur where Optimus Prime shows up. And his design is a bit of a question mark, and that's something they kind of explain later. And then as well as other stuff with Sentinel Prime, who supposedly dies at the end of Megatron Origin, but the way the writer described it for the artist, he said, well, it looks like he could go either way. And then it seems like he's dead later, and then there's other stories that happen where, like, no, he's probably alive. And so the fate of Sentinel Prime is another thing. So this is a very weird sort of universe. Basically what IDW has done is they've taken everything for their Transformers universe and tried to put it into like these big tomes. And so the first phase of it, as they call it, is collected in 8 of these hardcovers, which, by the way, are beautiful hardcovers. The only complaint with these being that sometimes the spines are a little bit weak, but they're drawn beautifully. There's kind of like a sketchy drawing of whatever Transformer they have in the front. They look magnificent on a shelf. They've even got these little bookmarks, which I love. Everyone loves them. They're great for placement. And these are definitely worth getting. The problem simply being that the list price for these are $50. And in a world where you can get $20 of epic collections from Marvel that collect like 30 issues in paperback in good bindings, $50 for, say, 17 issues is a bit much, regardless of the presentation. So buying these for cheap is certainly possible, but just know that they are a little bit overpriced. Okay, so before we get into this specific topic of review, I'm going to try and give some history. Because I didn't really know a lot of this, and I bought these volumes, and then I started looking into it as I was reading. And it's kind of confusing, just jumping right into this, so I want to make sure everyone is on the same playing field. So essentially, Transformers had their comics by Marvel. And Marvel had their Generation 1 comics, and Marvel had their Generation 2 comics, and the last Generation 2 comic was published in something like 1994. Cut ahead to a few years, and there was a bunch of image artists that were working at that company that were doing things, chief among them, Pat Lee, who offshooted from Image and made a company called Dreamwave. And Dreamwave got the license from Hasbro to publish more Transformers comics. And so at that point when they were publishing comics, we didn't have the original G1 cartoon on anymore, and we didn't have Beast Wars on anymore. And so what we got at that meantime is stuff from the Unicron trilogy, the Transformers Armada, Energon, and Cybertron series that was going on around the 2000s. And that series is kind of gets mixed responses. It's the one that I mostly grew up with, but there are a lot of people that hate it, there are a lot of people that love it. It just kind of depends on who you talk to and whether or not they've rewatched it recently. And so Unicron as this reality warping entity and that kind of stuff really came from Dreamwave's era of publishing Transformers comics. They had a lot of stuff that was built into that continuity, as well as a lot of offshoots and minis and such, and they kind of did what IDW was doing, which is building a giant comprehensive Transformers universe. Not the way Marvel was doing it, which was just kind of shorter. And so the architect of most Transformers comics, including the Dreamwave stuff, is Simon Furman. And so Simon Furman's a guy that worked on Transformers UK and did an amazing job. And then he came over around issue 50-something of Transformers in America and did an amazing job there. And then Simon Furman was part of the list of writers and creators for Dreamwave's Transformers line. And this is where the problems come in. So essentially Dreamwave was distributing a lot of like Hasbro, Capcom licensed properties, and they had very few of their own, and they kept shafting their own creators' independent ideas for these licensed properties, and these licensed properties mostly didn't last. A lot of the Capcom stuff didn't even get like their first issues published before they were gone, and so instead of that, you had lots of Transformers, Mega Man, and things like that, and the problem that they had with those particular comics, and then what other companies had with stuff like G.I. Joe, is that they could only distribute them to the U.S., and these were Canadian companies. And so there was a whole bit of like trouble building these comics for an international audience, but only being able to sell them to the U.S. And after that, we get into the most notable problem with Dreamwave, which is they stopped paying their creators. They get to this point where writers and artists at Dreamwave are writing and creating these comics without getting paid. And they started building this kind of house style, which is a thing with Marvel and DC that's arguable depending on who you talk to, but Dreamwave was really, really gung-ho about this house style thing. Everyone had to draw in the style of, I think it was Pat Lee, and this led to certain artists drawing things for stuff like War Within that were completely redrawn by their inkers to look more like Pat Lee, and the end result looks really, really bad. And that's why historically some of those comics are just not very good. And then Mike Costa, who would later write Transformers for IDW, talked about how he was initially offered to do stuff with Dreamwave, but is glad he didn't because of that creator issue and stuff like that. And then there were a lot of writers and artists at Dreamwave that were kind of like their tentpole guys that got kicked out after bringing in new writers and artists. And so you kept bringing people in and losing people, and you kept not paying any of them, and you kept redoing their work and trying to like fit it all against this one guy's ego, namely Pat Lee. And after all of that debacle, the final straw for a lot of people was when Simon Furman, who was writing these comics, ended up on the list of writers not getting paid. And after that, things really started falling apart for them. I mean, they were always falling apart, but they really started to fall apart at this point. And Dreamwave went into bankruptcy. And so when Dreamwave went into bankruptcy, Hasbro before that decided not to renew the license for them to publish Transformers comics. And Pat Lee kept trying to revive Dreamwave into different sort of projects, and all of them ended badly, and they kept continuing to not pay their creators. And so there were a lot of stories meant for the Dreamwave canon, or parts of the Dreamwave canon, that influence stuff that IDW does later. And you get this thing where some of Dreamwave's comics either get repurposed or scrapped, and they had like this fan vote to decide what their next Transformers ongoing was going to be, and they decided on Beast Wars, which was going to be written by Simon Furman, and then obviously that never came out because Dreamwave went bankrupt, and so there was just lots of fan anger towards them, lots of creative anger towards them. They were a really, really bad company, and mostly because of Pat Lee. And so fast forward through all of that, and Dreamwave's gone. Dreamwave 2 is probably still around, but they're kind of gone. They blamed their financial failure on being the only independent publisher in Canada and the weakness of the US dollar, which were both bad excuses because they weren't true. And so fast forward a little bit, they're gone, and then IDW gets the Transformers license. And then IDW brings in Simon Furman. And Simon Furman, this guy that's been working on Transformers UK, Transformers with Marvel, working on tons and tons of stuff for the Armada and Cybertron stuff and the War Within and everything for Dreamwave. This kind of chief architect of Transformers is brought back in to do IDW comics. And he's talked about it as he's kind of like the all-star Transformers writer, but what he's doing for IDW is finally his take on the Transformers. When IDW got the license, they were toying with kind of this Crisis on Infinite Earths idea, where they take like the Cybertron continuity, and they take like the original G1 stuff, and they take a whole bunch of different ongoing Transformers universes and sort of have them coalesce into one big event piece. Problem with that being, it would be really confusing, and people probably wouldn't buy it if you weren't reading stuff from like War Within with Dreamwave, or you didn't really know your G1, that wouldn't have worked out for you, and it would have been a bad business move on their part. So they scrap that, and they bring in Simon Furman, and they basically say, okay, do your Transformers universe. Do what you want with these characters, not based on our framework. And so he does, and he turns it into this very slow-burned, more philosophical comic. And he changes a lot of things, but he keeps a lot of the spirit of the stuff the same. And instead of making it like an all-out war kind of thing, it's more about these robots as people. It's more about like this sort of Cold War state, this idea of both the Autobots and the Decepticons being bad, infiltration being a literal infiltration, the Decepticons not being arrogant with their power and just showing up, blowing things up, but being discreet and genuinely being robots in disguise, which is all really interesting, but people didn't dig it. And so Simon Furman kept having to revamp it and try and be like, okay, well, now it's more action-y, and that didn't really work out. Well, okay, now it's more espionage, spy-y, and action-y, and that didn't really work out. The way he wanted to do the comics kept getting problematic until eventually we got to like the Phase 2 more than meets the eye stuff, which everybody loves. And so Simon Furman, despite being like the chief architect for this universe, had a lot of problems being able to maintain what he wanted due to fan reactions. And so IDW realized that, and they were kind of bummed that he didn't get a chance to do everything that he wanted, and so they gave him the Maximum Dinobots mini, which we'll talk about later. And so Simon Furman is kind of the main influence here. So I want to make sure everyone understands that and has some of that history, because it explains why some of these comics don't work as well as they ought to. Now, the thing we're talking about today, I know this far into the video, the thing we're actually talking about today is the 4-issue miniseries from 2007 called Megatron Origin. Now, Megatron Origin is the first comic that appears in these IDW collections as the start of their universe, as their suggested reading order places it. And Megatron Origin is written by a guy named Eric Holmes. And Eric Holmes originally had this idea for Dreamwave. Dreamwave's canon of Transformers comics was supposed to have a 6-issue miniseries titled Megatron Origin. And IDW took a lot of Dreamwave's scrapped ideas and reworked them into their canon. And one of them is Megatron Origin. And Megatron Origin, instead of being 6 issues the way it was supposed to be in Dreamwave, got turned into 4 issues. And because of that, there's a whole subplot with Megatron getting some kind of mentor that turns him into a gladiator, that helps him build the Decepticon legacy and stuff. All that gets omitted. And Megatron Origin kind of turns into this like truncated 4-issue mini that skips around a lot. And the problem here is these Transformers comics were never meant to be read in chronological order. The way they're published here, you weren't supposed to read Megatron Origin first. That's not how that comic was written. It's how IDW retroactively suggests you get into the universe, but that book was never meant to be a 4-issue mini that was someone's introduction to Transformers. And so reading it first can be a bit of a problem. It's not new reader friendly. And that would be like the chief criticism of this book that I'm going to make, which is that it's not new reader friendly at all. And so you need to look things up more. The Transformers wiki is really helpful. It's really sarcastic about some of these things, and it's very poking fun at the craziness of this continuity. The biggest problem with Megatron Origin is the way it's written. It seems like there were several time jumps. And so you get to a status quo by the end of an issue, and then by the next issue, you've fast-forwarded through the character development that happens in between, and just got to a new status quo. And so by the end of this mini, when the Great War has begun, you don't really understand why or how. If you don't know Transformers, if you don't know this universe, if you don't know the retroactive stuff that was done later, then the way this mini reads, you really don't understand how these events are unfolding. The Decepticon point of view is something that we examine much more in later comics. The Autobot point of view is something we examine much more in later comics. And in fact, just in this collection, when you get to Spotlight Blur, the way the Transformers War is going is not the way it's supposedly set up in Megatron Origin. And part of this problem is that the way Megatron Origin reads is that Cybertron's got like a caste system. And Autobots are kind of the head honchos, and the way this continuity reads, it's almost as if it's the Autobots' fault for starting the Great War. Essentially what we have in this story is we open it up with a Energon mining operation. And in the Energon mining operation, you see Megatron, and he's deep in the nick of getting some Energon, and then this senator shows up. And the senator is really, really hateful towards Energon miners. He just doesn't like them. He just does this as a formality. And that becomes a recurring theme throughout this, which is Autobots following protocol. And Autobots in air quotes, we'll talk about that later. Autobots following protocol. And so he gives this speech, and basically what he says is, you Energon miners are going to be relocated and given new jobs. We're going to automate the mines, despite the mines actually still having some Energon left over. And the big point of contention for these other Transformers that are working in the mines is that despite how much Energon we've mined, there's still a shortage. So it must be that the higher-ups are hoarding the Energon, and that's a continued trend throughout this comic, is that the higher-ups of Transformer society are taking most of the resources and the wealth. So somebody speaks out. Somebody complains to the senator as he's speaking about all this inequality. And he's attacked for it. And while he's attacked, Megatron, for whatever reason, decides to take his Energon axe and hurl it at the senator. And then Megatron's attacked. And then Megatron fights back. And Megatron is supposed to feel like he didn't intend for any of this to happen. Megatron, throughout the first issue, reads as if, no, I didn't mean to kill that security guard. I didn't mean to start this conflict. But the way the art draws things, Megatron very consciously and calculatingly hurls an axe across the room at a senator and then, like, smashes a robot's head in. It's supposed to be kind of the New Frontier-esque situation of Hal Jordan dropping and being in the middle of a struggle, and just in the heat of the battle, you don't notice that you're killing someone. That's what it's supposed to be. But the way the art makes it, it seems like Megatron is very consciously orchestrating these events, even though he's not. And that's part of the confusion. The art is both really good and really bad. It's really good in the sense that the designs are fantastic, the details are great, just the way this artist is able to make these giant one-page or two-page spreads is just magnificent. It's bad in the sense that it's bad sequential art. It's bad in the sense that what the words are saying and what the art is conveying are not working together. And the sequence of events is extremely confusing. It's very hard for you to go from panel to panel and figure out what the range of motion is supposed to be or what the range of emotion is. You can't pinpoint the beat changes in the art, which sounds like a nitpick, but it's not, because it makes this book really confusing. It makes this book, which is supposed to be a very simple story, a lot more complicated than it really should be, because it's very difficult to tell whether Megatron's lying about not trying to start this war, or if he actually is telling the truth and he doesn't know what's going on and he's supposed to be the victim. It's very confusing. The book, in places, plays this as if the Autobots are like this decadent rich, this on the cusp of society kind of thing, because almost all of the senators and almost all the nice cities that we see are Autobots. And the idea here is, after Megatron gets captured and breaks out of prison, and Sentinel Prime sends Prowl after him, the idea then is supposed to be that Megatron meets Soundwave, and Soundwave is the guy that gives him all of his weapons. And Soundwave is actually working for another senator named Ratbat, who is one of Soundwave's cassettes that we get towards the end of this. And Senator Ratbat is an Autobot. And he is actually manipulating global events and stock prices and energon supplies in order to line his own pockets, even though it worsens the state of Cybertron as a whole. And in worsening that state of Cybertron, it leads one of the miners to revolt against the Senator, which leads Megatron to help fight back, which leads to the Great War. So it's supposed to be this decadent, rich Autobot that actually starts the war. And it's supposed to be like this neat reversal of, look, Megatron's kind of the victim here. But then it kind of reads the other way, which is Soundwave betrays Senator Ratbat, which he does by the end of this, and Megatron has calculatingly moved himself up through Cybertronian ranks in order to raise an army against Cybertron because he wants to beat people up. And it's very strange, because then you get to the second issue, which is Megatron's now a gladiator. And that's part of the problem of making a 6-issue mini a 4-issue mini, because all the stuff in the middle that's supposed to be Megatron getting a mentor and becoming a gladiator is cut, and we just get to Megatron as a gladiator. And he's climbing up the ranks of gladiators, and he's kind of becoming in charge of them, and he's building new arenas and such, and Sentinel Prime is after him, and at that point he kills a couple of Autobots, and that's what Sentinel Prime uses as an excuse to attack this whole underground gladiator operation. Now, the way Megatron speaks, he acts as if what he wants the Decepticons to be are people with power that exercise it whenever they want. He, halfway through this book, becomes about the interest of the stronger, even though the initial setup leads you to believe that he is the revolutionary. And so those ideas are kind of in conflict with each other. And in later Transformers comics, you do bridge some of these gaps, and you do understand why he's building this army and why people look up to him and what the Decepticons are, but that's in later books. As the way it's collected in here, as the introduction to this Transformers universe, it's really confusing, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. And even taking those extra bits of canon into account, this story itself is very poorly told because it's not able to naturally bridge you scene to scene. It's just got a complete lack of flow, and you really have no idea what's going on. As I was reading each issue, which, by the way, the issues are very short, it only takes you maybe 5 to 10 minutes to read an issue, and it's only 4 issues long, about, give or take half an hour, you're probably done. But after I finished reading each issue, I went to the Transformers wiki and I read the summary of the issue. Because what I thought was going on, I wasn't sure of. And so I wanted to double check and read the entries. And if you read each one of these entries on the Megatron Origins issues by the guys at Transformers Wiki, they're really sarcastic about it. And they're like, well, this is what's going on, parentheses, maybe hyperlinked to something else that contradicts it. And they're really poking fun at how this story doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. And their big criticism being that Sentinel Prime, is he dead or is he not dead? And so that kind of becomes the crux of the problem. The other thing is that despite me liking the details of the art, it is bad sequential art. And there's lots of criticisms lobbed at this book for being very poorly colored. Because there are a lot of scenes through lots of issues where the characters that we see are colored as someone else. There were scenes where Megatron's captured, he's used the Seekers to capture the senator that we meet in the beginning of the book, and in that scene he's colored to look different, so you aren't sure who he is until we get to his name. There are lots of moments here where, like, the two Autobots that are after Megatron are colored differently. Sentinel Prime is colored differently throughout the book. Soundwave is drawn in scenes that he's not actually supposed to be in because it contradicts the way the story is supposed to be told. it's really poorly drawn and it's really poorly colored. So if you know your Transformers and you know who's supposed to be who, and you're just looking at this book, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense as to what's actually going on. It's not a very good comic. And I was prepared to go into this because I was talking to Eric about this. I told him I got this collection and what should I read up on to like understand what's going on. And he told me some of the details about the creator stuff, as well as his opinions on some of these issues. And then I did some of my own research, and the way the consensus I'm reading from a lot of people is that Megatron Origin is really bad. And so I went into this expecting, with low expectations, but hoping, no, it's 4 issues, it's Megatron's origin, it's a perspective we've never seen before. This could be interesting, this could be good, and it's not. It's really not. It's really bad. And I know I have more to say about this, but I feel like I'm going to keep repeating myself. So I'm just going to go ahead and go off of some of my notes that I've kept on my phone here, because they seem to make less and less sense as I'm talking about it. So by the end, Sentinel Prime and Megatron have a battle with each other. And in that battle, Sentinel Prime has this thing called the Apex system, which is hilarious and awesome. And it's basically a giant robot inside of a giant robot. And that fight's cool, but again, the fate of Sentinel Prime doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And so by the end of this, when you get to like Spotlight Blur, the intention is supposed to be, the intention is supposed to be we don't know his fate, but the way it reads is Sentinel Prime is dead and the Great War has begun. But we don't understand the branding of the Decepticons. And so Megatron's got this necklace with a Decepticon logo on him all the way through the story, and we don't know what it's supposed to mean or where it comes from or what we're supposed to take away from it, and it just becomes the brand of the Decepticons for whatever reason. And then there's a whole bunch of like continuity stuff with like, well, Prowl knows Sentinel Prime's a corrupt politician, but he's not saying anything and we don't know why. Sentinel Prime is the successor to another Prime that we hear of later, and then Optimus Prime shows up in Spotlight Blur, and you're not really sure of the flow of events, particularly in relation to the succession of the Primes. And so that stuff is really weird. One of the more interesting elements, though, is Megatron as the victim, is this idea of making Megatron a seeker of justice in this horrible caste system. And one of the things I really appreciate about that is the idea of Megatron being an energon miner before he becomes a gladiator, and like his need to be about power comes from his constant universal lack of power. And so when you get to the energon mines, it's really interesting that we talk about this artificial intelligence argument and how machines are now able to think, and Transformers are sentient robots that now have to deal with automation. And so bringing that argument into a like more vicious cycle is just really interesting, and I want to know where more of that goes, even though this book doesn't really do a good job of explaining that to you. And so another thing I want to mention as far as that goes, I'm sorry, I'm just reading my notes as we talk about this because there's a lot here. And so another thing I want to talk about in relation to that is this idea of the Autobot and the Decepticon war not really being a war between two factions of opposing ideology, but being a war, or being more of a revolution, being more of the oppressed in the Decepticons come up against the Autobots. And then in later books, particularly when you get to Spotlight Cliffjumper, is this idea that Autobots are just as bad as Decepticons, that Autobots are people that are okay with casualties, are okay with just hiding and stowing away in like this false Cold War mentality in order to get the jump on Decepticons, and they are killers, and they are just as brutal. And so in a lot of ways you're supposed to relate to the problems of the Decepticons because they are the worse off party, and it's because of the Autobots' manipulation of Cybertron events that this all happens. Problem being that the rest of Furman's Transformers IDW universe doesn't operate that way. And if you only read Megatron Origin, if you only read that as the first story within this universe, you get the wrong mindset going forward. And so the Transformers Great War in your mind, just based on Megatron Origin, is not what the books are continuing the ideology as. And so later, you will get like a more firm, this is the Autobot stance, this is the Decepticon stance, and this is the manipulation, and this is the revolution, and it's more of a political party argument as opposed to being workers and the oppressed argument. And so it's very asymmetrical. And so this book even operates that way, where like the first half of it is very much prison industrial complex, problem of bureaucracy, Transformers as being just more robotic than Transformers really are, and being all about the systems of oppression. And then the other half of the book is just, no, I just want to beat people up. I'm Megatron, and I've got these really big guns, and I should be in charge because I'm Megatron. And it's very strange, and it doesn't do a good job of conveying what his character arc is supposed to be throughout this. There's a really good bit of irony though in this, where in issue 3, Soundwave comes in and he says that you tasked me with finding some flyers, some Transformers that had the ability to fly. And in the opening of this, there is some discussion about like anti-gravity technology, and so clearly some time has passed between that first issue and that third issue where Soundwave brings Megatron the Seekers, led by Starscream. And there's some really good bit of irony here, where at the end of the third issue, Megatron's horde, his armies, are captured by the Autobot authorities and thrown in prison. And then Starscream turns state's evidence and he says, oh, no, I will tell you everything if you let me go. And Megatron says, oh no, we have to kill him. And they can't. And so they said, well, how much does he know? And Megatron's like, everything. He trusted Starscream the most, and at the end of that, it looks like Starscream betrayed him. Then you get to fourth issue, and it turns out Starscream is actually just following orders, and he's not there to tattle on Megatron. He's there to aid in the prison escape and kill the Primes and start to take over this city. And in that fourth issue, it's also Starscream that gives Megatron his giant arm cannon. Which is really cool. I love this idea. I love this irony of Starscream being Megatron's most trusted aide. And Starscream historically is kind of like that, but he's always more conniving and sneaky and underhanded. And in this version, he's not that yet. In this version, he's just a really, really good soldier. And I like that. I think it's really cool that he is Megatron's right hand. And so later when we get to more of his deceptiveness, there is a bit of a friendship there. There is a bit of I trusted you once, I'll trust you again kind of mentality that we've established, which I really like. The other thing is that the first casualty in this Cybertronian Great War is the city of Kahan, K-A-O-N is how they spell it, which is described as the worst city in the entire planet. It's a hangover from the Dreamwave days with the War Within, and it's supposed to be like this, literally the worst place on the planet to be, in like this decadent population, and the gladiator matches are there, and it's like literally the bottom of the barrel. And Megatron, as a gladiator there, he escapes after being imprisoned during the first issue, and he goes to that city and he rises the ranks there. And so the first casualty of the Cybertronian War is that city. And so he completely takes over and it becomes his area. And it's interesting that if you keep with the theme of the first two issues, that Megatron's rise to power would come both from the bottom in his social class, but the bottom of the social class of Cybertron as well when he represented in that city. Now, obviously, the book doesn't keep up with that and doesn't realize what it is halfway through, and so it just becomes the first fallen city. But initially, the history behind that city is really interesting, and I do appreciate that. So, Megatron Origin 1 through 4 is not something I'd recommend. I don't think it's very good. However, you kind of have to read it. And you have to read it despite you not knowing the events. Oh, okay, I'll say this. You have to look up the Wikipedia summary of it. Because despite it not being very good, it is something that you need going forward, particularly when you get to later issues that retcon some of these events. And so there will be issues later where characters start talking about the history of Megatron, and they insert things that only make sense and improve on if you know this backstory. So you do have to read it. It's not very good, but it is essential reading, and so I appreciate IDW including it in. At the same time, though, I disagree with their reading order, and I feel like if you just started this with Spotlight Blur and gone all the way through Infiltration and Stormbringer, it would have made a lot more sense, and you could put Megatron Origin in later. So it's badly placed, but it is important reading. So yeah, I wouldn't recommend seeking it out. But I would recommend buying these collections and going through some of this, because there's some really good stuff in here. It's a bit of a mixed bag from the beginning. So yeah, I know this one ran a little bit long, and I know I wasted a lot of time in the beginning talking about like Dreamwave and stuff. But I think it's important to understand all that going forward, especially when you talk about some of the stories in IDW's universe being good, because of Furman, or being bad because Furman didn't get a chance to do what he wanted, or some continuity leaps here and there that you may not know that come from Dreamwave, because this is very much a reboot of Generation 1, but a lot of what IDW is doing isn't just pulling from the old Generation 1 cartoon. It isn't just pulling from the old Unicron trilogy. It isn't just, it's not even really part of the Transformers Prime War for Cybertron video game universe. It's kind of the greatest hits of Transformers all thrown together that you are put in the middle of, and you have to go forward from there. And so you don't need to know Transformers history in order to keep going with the series, because it explains its own versions of it. But at the same time, it helps to understand some of the behind-the-scenes Transformers history stuff in order to understand why some stories are good and why some stories are bad, and why, like this one, you have to understand Megatron Origin and why it's placed at the beginning of this book, even if you don't actually read it. And so I feel like all of that's contextual information that is kind of necessary. So yeah, let me know what you guys think in the comments, whether you read Megatron Origin, whether you liked it or hated it, what you think of the IDW Transformers universe, whether you agree or disagree with anything I said. Thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you next time.